It's one of the most fascinating stories to come out of Italy in the 70s. I remember it very, very well indeed, but even though I was but a boy. White Suicide spins a story of espionage, secrecy and revenge, and in the months and years following the kidnapping and subsequent assassination of Aldo Moro, known to be one of Italy's and the Cold War's visionary leaders. Aldo Moro served as Italian Prime Minister for 2 terms in the 60s and 70s. It is the subject of a fascinating book called White Suicide. It is written by Simon Gaul. I'd like to say that Simon joins me live on the line now. Good morning to you, Simon.
Good morning, Giles. Thank you very much for having me on your show.
The pleasure's all mine. Whereabouts are you, by the way, today? Where do we find you on God's green earth?
Well, there's even a story to that one. I'm in the Bernese Oberland. I'm up in the Swiss Alps, where its most famous Brit, John le Carré, used to have, well, he still does, his family does. And it's where, when it all got too much in Cornwall, he would retreat here and write his books from here.
Fascinating, because I can see you on the sky, and I thought that doesn't look like a.
Oh yes, there's a mountain. Well, in 3 months' time, that'll all be covered in snow.
Fabulous. Anyway, back cut to the chase. Now, set the scene, because Italian politics is fascinating, infuriating, confusing, and that's for those who know something about it. And so, set the scene, if you would, for A, who Aldo Moro was, and B, the struggle between basically the socialist stroke communists and the Italian state and police forces and other shadowy organisations.
It's yeah, very good question. Basically, we've got to go back through Europe, and the Cold War's decisions were all made by the Soviet Union, by the United States, by Great Britain, and to a lesser extent. But Italy was a NATO country, and for the very first time ever, the Italian Communist Party got 35% of the popular vote in an openly funded the dour cold people from Moscow. Anyway, what Aldo Moro did was he presented Italian government since day dot.
Yeah, Simon,
I understand you've got a situation.
Just quickly, Simon, if you turn the video, because you're cutting out on me left and right, so we're getting every third word. So what we'll do is just cut the video, because I think that's maybe something to do with the link, and we'll try and we'll take it from there, and hopefully the quality, because obviously I don't want to miss the quality. So just quickly, I know you were we got about half of that about the situation with Italy being a communist, putting the collywobbles, to put it mildly, up NATO because they got 75% of the vote being communists.
Absolutely, no, 35%. And that had never happened. The communist parties of various European countries at the time, the Soviets had never had a reach such as that into a first world country, Italy, and also into a NATO country. Now, this, of course, sparked the attention of the Americans, who were having none of it. Whatever one's views, the Americans do love to interfere in other people's politics. And Aldo Moro went ahead, despite very serious warnings from the State Department, then President Carter, interestingly, George H.W. Bush, head of the CIA, that if he went ahead with this coalition from his Democratic Party with the Communist Party, there would be ramifications. He ignored those bravely, and on the day that he was due in Parliament on the 16th of March 1978 at 10 o'clock, this was to be signed into law. Well, in the morning, he was kidnapped, and his 5-man bodyguard team were executed in one of the most flawless operations. 91 even touched Aldo Moro. This was done with a precision that the world has it, that the CIA, the Mossad, the various other people could have organized. The Red Big, a ragtag organization that used to go around murdering business people and blowing up inconsequential buildings. And from that moment onwards, a First World leader kept imprisoned. You try and keep, I don't know, Mr. Sunak in prison for 5 minutes, let alone 5 hours, let alone 5 months, 5 days. Same with Mr. Biden, the world leader. Yet Moro was kept hidden in Rome for 54 days. It is, in our view, incomprehensible at that period of time, and he couldn't be found. 38,000 Italian police and soldiers were out looking for him, couldn't find him. Very, very peculiar.
But you have to look at, I suppose the thing is, you have to look at this political situation there and the fact that you have, if you like, this, because of the devastation wrought by the Second World War on Italy, you have the socialist movement, the communist movement making great bounds. And it's, you mentioned the Red Army faction in Italy. It's the 70s is the time, if you like, of terrorism. You have the PLO, you have Baader-Meinhof, you have the troubles in Ireland. But especially groups like Baader-Meinhof and the Red Brigade are basically going for this sort of Maoist socialist utopia they're going for, and obviously the thought of any NATO member at this particular time, being socialist puts the absolute, fear of the proverbial into the other NATO members, the US especially, and also because Italy, still has a backbone which has, Mussolini's only been gone for 30 years, and there is this very, very conservative Italian Italian society.
Absolutely correct. And it became pretty bleakly obvious that someone had to have their fingers in the pie, from Baader-Meinhof to all the other Maoist, yes, but certainly communist left-wing parties that were operating in Europe at the time. None of them, and I repeat, none, were capable of pulling off pulling off a kidnap in such a way. It was like amateur night at the opera. I mean, the Italian politics is full of opera. This was just another bit of bad opera. But this was executed, no pun intended, faultlessly. Absolutely faultlessly. It took the entire assassination of his 5-man bodyguard team and his kidnap took less than 90 seconds. I repeat, 90 bullets were loosed off. Not one touched the man.
Yes.
And at 10:01, the Italian equivalent, Mr. Gaul, the Italian equivalent, the Speaker of the House of Commons, declared that Mr. Moro had been kidnapped, and therefore the Communist Party alliance and the Christian Democrat alliance could therefore not be signed. And ultimately, the people behind it finally had their prize. Because a communist would have sat in on the Communist Party, openly funded by Moscow, would have sat in and been cabinet members of an Italian government.
So looking at what was the immediate response to them? Because obviously, if a Sunak, if a Biden was kidnapped, or even going back to this period, if a Callahan in the UK was kidnapped, there would have been an immediate response. There would have been search teams out there. There would have been, they would have called in specialists. There would have been international condemnation. What was the international reaction? What was the national reaction? Because did sort of forces swing into action, or was there something of a delay?
There was a delay. I'm going to say, in their defence, was one of sheer shock. But by that time, it didn't really start to kick off until late it happened. I think people do move with a far greater speed today in controlling and looking after their various different political leaders. But the fact that it even happened, is in and of itself extraordinary. So then, when the penny dropped, Italy went in. And that was, I remember reading, I was living in Malta at the time, and I remember reading the story and being absolutely captivated by the fact that he wasn't immediately found. This became more and more preposterous. And he was allowed to have he was allowed to have a dialogue of letters, which he wrote from his prison cell, which of course no one knew where his prison cell was, because of the 38,000 soldiers, carabinieri, and the various other special forces. They've got the equivalent of MI5 there, obviously. No one could find even so much as a whiff. Whereas all along, he'd been kept in a Red Brigade's apartment up in the north part of Rome, near called the Tomba di Nero, which is the Nero's tomb, but Nero certainly wasn't buried there.
Right.
And he was kept in a simple residential street, locked up in what was called the People's Prison. Again, play the tape, as you rightly said. James Callaghan was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom at the time. It's inconceivable that way from where, I don't know, say he was staying at Chequers, on his way to number 10, that he was ambushed in the village outside Chequers. I'm afraid I don't know what it is. Well, you'd think that it would have taken more than 54 days to find where Mr. Callaghan was.
Yeah. Just as a thing here, just as a note here as well. So he's in a residential place. He's in the People's Prison by the Red Brigade. What if the Red Brigade, which is, it is a terrorist organisation, unless I'm sadly mistaken, what have they got to gain by kidnapping Morrow? Because presumably, or helping in the kidnap, or aiding, or providing a safe house, or whatever, providing a prison. Surely, something like a communist influenced government in Italy is going to benefit the Red Brigade, unless they are so severely Maoist that only total overthrow will satisfy their needs.
Good question. The Red Brigades, being left wing, would have liked to have seen a Communist Party sharing power. However, the Red Brigade's command structure, and the book is not littered with details like that. This book does have a beginning and a middle and an end, and a goodie and a baddie.
Yeah.
But the Red Brigade's command structure was 4 chiefs. And the CIA's history is using effectively local talent, lowercase t, on the ground, and supplying at the same time their own expertise. Now, the other possible, NATO had its own equivalent of the CIA called Operation Gladio, that they could have been involved, but there would have been too many leaks from that. Whilst Morrow's opinions on the Middle East situation didn't suit the Israelis, it's unlikely that the Mossad had anything to do with it. And effectively, the CIA were hiring some guns in order to do it on the ground. You couldn't exactly have special forces wandering around on the route, the 20-minute route from Morrow's home. He used to stop at a church en route to Parliament.
Right.
And you wouldn't have had American soldiers doing it, but they could quite easily have trained the Red Brigade, who essentially needed training.
Yeah. And of course, and this always goes back as well, because, to put it mildly, the American-Italian experience is, again, complex. We have that whole situation with, the migration of Italians over to America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They still have, the CIA is very operational in Italy straight after the war, recruiting people on the rat lines, etc. So that whole, and Italian Americans, and I count several of them as my friends, tend to be very conservative in their approach to politics, and a pretty deep hatred of all things socialist and communist.
Absolutely correct. And in the Americans' defense, if I can say that, they had semaphored to the Italian government that under no circumstances were a communist party going as so much as even be the cleaner in the cabinet office. Were into law that day a coalition government in the much same way the Conservative Party had one with the Liberal Democrats. And Mr. Clegg sat at the right hand of the then Prime Minister David Cameron. The exact same was going to happen. And that wasn't going to happen as far as the Americans were concerned. They did warn him. They were pretty clear in his warning. There was a meeting that took place, according to Morrow's widow, between Kissinger and a CIA officer in the month before he was kidnapped, whereby he was told that certain things would happen if he actually proceeded with this coalition. Morrow hesitated for the first time in his life about quitting politics, decided not to, carried on, and we all know what happened on the 16th of March, 1978.
And so was the whole thing entirely cold then? There were absolutely no breaks no breaks?
There were a few breaks. There was the leaking of where he was allegedly held. This was passed on to a Christian Democrat politician, a man called Romano Prodi, also went on to become Prime Minister of Italy twice, but more important and more bizarrely, he became President in Commission, the second most important position in Europe. He's still alive, and he divulged the address of where Morrow was suffocated for about 5 days. And when, of course, it was finally found out, and it was raided, they'd found that Morrow had been there, but he'd been moved. There were inside movements to try and get Morrow free, but there was so much corruption going on that this effectively proved impossible. Hero in the book, to give him his name, is the man who Romano Prodi tells the address to. And because the book is a mixture of fact and fiction, page-turning thriller, as well as it's a factual expose of what I believe happened. And I'm not alone in my beliefs.
What about, because there are other forces at play. I mean, we're talking about the Red Brigades, but also, is it the NAR? That was the far-right fascist group who blew up Bologna, 3 years later, blew up the station. The the Italian right-wing group. And also, of course, there's P2, which is a very interesting group.
Well, P2 was called the shadow government of Propaganda Due, was called the shadow government. Anyone who was anyone, from lawyers to servants of the Vatican to politicians, Silvio Berlusconi was a member of P2, was effectively involved in all of this. And P2 play a very, very big part in the story. And they were behind, there was about 980 P2 members, from, as I said, bankers through to the church, through to the politicians. I mean, Italy is a three-pronged: church, business, and politicians. And they all three work hand in hand.
And I suppose
it's a fascinating example. And
I do suppose the other thing is the fact that if Morrow was to upset the Apple, I mean, they're always saying that Agnelli, was basically running it at the time anyway. So what the politicians were kind of doing was kind of irrelevant. But if they did bring in sweeping reforms, these left wing reforms and whatever, then you don't want to accept. It would upset the church, the state, and business, which is pretty much the three things that you don't want to muck up.
Absolutely. Americans were most afraid of. And was the fact that the communists, who I repeat, were openly funded by the Politburo Moscow, which, as we all know, was a was a Soviet country. It was the USSR. It was public enemy number one. I mean, they had missiles pointed at America. America had missiles pointed at it. The fact that a fully paid up member of the Communist Party, both in Italy and in Russia, the Soviet Union, would be sitting at a cabinet table where NATO secrets, etc., were being discussed was just incomprehensible to the Americans, unless it suited them. I mean, you can go right the way back to Operation Husky, which was the American plan in 1943 and successfully executed to invade Sicily and therefore overthrow. Now, the American government at the time, led by the U.S. State Naval Intelligence Unit, went to a mafia boss, two bosses, Meyer Lansky, who wasn't in prison, and Lucky Luciano, who was in prison, a Sicilian. And they offered them a deal. The deal was this: if they marshal their troops, so to speak, their soldiers, their mafia, on the ground in Sicily and assisted the American invasion, Luciano would be given a free pardon. He was serving life. And Meyer Lansky and Luciano agreed to this. And there was no doubt at all that part of the success of Operation Husky, I say only 6,000 Allied lives were lost in that invasion. It was the most extraordinarily swift, was down to the input of Mr. Luciano from his New York prison and Mr. Lansky from his New York apartment. Cut a long story short, the Americans kept their deal. 1946, the ink barely dry. Meyer Lansky is put on a boat to Naples, and thank you very much for your help. Not Meyer Lansky, sorry, Luciano. Yeah. Meyer Lansky was, in a secret ceremony, awarded the U.S. a Medal of Freedom, the equivalent of sort of the GC and or VC rolled into one, in a private ceremony by the then President Truman, again in 1946, for his help in, and this we're talking about number one equal mafia boss, awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Truman in a room in the White House privately for assisting in the American invasion of Italy. There is a history going back to Lansky and to Lucky Luciano of Americans' involvement in all forms of Italian politics.
It's absolutely fascinating, and also it's this hate, this American hate, because we're looking at, it's the 70s, and also that whole period of talk about Truman, because we've got rid of the Nazis, but most of them are now working on with Operation Paperclip, and most of them are now working on our space program or our rocket program, and so the biggest threat is the communists, and therefore we will use whatever forces we need to oppose the communists, and also it's Soviet Union, it's a Brezhnev era Soviet Union. It's not a warm and friendly Gorbachev Soviet Union.
Absolutely, this was very well said, Giles. It was a very hostile Soviet Union. I mean, Brezhnev followed on from Khrushchev, who had, last time I read about, he was pointing trying to point missiles at Florida from Cuba.
It really, and I'm going to run out of time because as you can probably tell, Simon, you and I had this conversation, I think, till Thursday. But the thing is, it reads like you're sitting there in Switzerland, the land of Le Carre, if you like, and it reads like a Dan Brown straight, Tom Clancy, whatever novel, but it is absolutely based on the facts and figures. But, I remember that awful, and I would be a schoolboy at the time, but I remember seeing that photograph. It's probably one of the first sort of photographs of that type I saw, of him, because there wasn't his body found in the boot of a car, wasn't it?
Yes, and in another lovely operatic Italian touch, the car was positioned exactly in between the Communist Party headquarters and the Democratic Party headquarters. It was literally equidistant between the two. And of course, in a typical Italian little touch, the car happened to be in a second-hand, broken-down old French car. because there was a lot of animosity going on between the Italians and the French at the same time. President Giscard d'Estaing was a little too right-wing for Italian tastes. But it's just also worth pointing out that anything that's in the book is, I would like to be able to say, you may factually be able to rely upon. The research done on it was pretty extensive over a lengthy period of time. Fortunately, I speak agricultural Italian. I was able to get by. Just also reads very much like a narrative.
Yeah,
but it's a scary narrative.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and the echoes of, and again, it's a fascinating book, and it's with the whole timeline that you just described, from Operation Husky through to pretty much the present day, and that time of uncertainty in the 60s and 70s. The book is called White Suicide. It's by Simon Gaul, who we're speaking to today. Simon, if people want to find you online, how can they find you in the nicest possible way?
There's a website, funnily enough, it's just being built at the moment as we speak. It's www.simongaul.com. And the book is available on Amazon, and it's out in November. It's also available on W.H. Smith. It's cheaper from W.H. Smith.
And it's also available as a virtual download from our own virtual bookstore. So there you go. So listeners will be able to download it and find out more about it really is a fascinating period of history. The book is called White Suicide. It's by Simon Gaul. Simon, thank you so much for your time today.
Giles, thank you very much for your well-researched questions. They really were quite probing, and I was expecting something slightly different. And I was really glad it stayed absolutely on topic. Thank you.